Hello, my quilting friends! My name is Leah Day, and this week I have moved my Janome 1600 to my Grace Q-Zone hoop frame. So this little frame is only 4.5 feet wide, but I can quilt any size of quilt in it because it's kind of designed to work like a lap hoop, meaning that you clamp the quilt into the frame on all sides. Once you quilt that area, then you unclamp it and shift it over, very much like a traditional old school hand quilting lap hoop. Now, the cool thing about this frame is you can put a home machine on it. You can also put long arms on it. It's also compatible with our Qnique 15-inch long arm and our Qnique 19-inch long arm. But I've decided to try out my Janome 1600, which is a high-speed single stitch machine. The needle only goes up and down, and that actually makes it ideal for stitching on a frame like this. It also goes really, really fast, and that comes in handy as well. So I'm going to share with you all of the tips and tricks and little things about getting started using a home machine on a hoop frame. We've got to get our rails to the right height. That always seems to be a tricky thing. We've got to check in on tension, and then we have to work on getting a good balance of speed and movement. And this is something that goes back to regular free motion quilting, pushing the quilt underneath the needle. We always have to balance the speed our machine is running, meaning the needle bouncing up and down, with the movement the quilt is doing. So that's when we do it traditionally, that's pushing the quilt under the needle. In this case, it's the movement of the machine rolling around now on the carriage. And this is so much easier to move now because it's on wheels. So we have to think in terms of, okay, balancing that easy movement. And that means we have to put our foot down and go a little faster than you might expect. So I'm going to share all of these tips and tricks with you, how to get started, how to get the most out of your Q-Zone hoop frame using it with a home sewing machine. So let's get started. So the very first step is to place your machine on the carriage. And as you can see, I just tried to center it up here widthwise. So the machine's roughly running down the center of this plate. And if you have trouble placing this, just lock down these channel locks. You've got one here on the side, you've got another one way back here in the back. And locking down the channel locks just stops the carriage from moving, and that makes it easier to place your machine so it doesn't roll away from you as you're trying to set it down. Now I'm going to lock the machine in place using these little black and blue clamps. You just slot it into the slots on the carriage and just lock it down. Now, if you find that these are a little tricky to close, like if that latch isn't wanting to close all the way, just pull it back a little bit away from the frame. It actually pushes this blue part outward. So if you're having trouble closing it all the way, it might be that it's just simply resting too close to the side of the machine. So there we go. That is how to set up your machine very basically on a Q-Zone hoop frame. Just get it centered up on the top carriage and clamp it in place. With our home sewing machine in place, I'm now going to attach the back rail. This rail could not be attached before because it has to slot through the arm of your machine, just like so. Okay, so it locks in place, and then you place these covers and then have 3 screws on both sides. So I'm going to lock this in place real quick, and then we're going to get this rail to the right height. Now, a quick tip when you're setting up your frame, go on ahead and lift these sides to their, not necessarily the highest level, but just at least into the middle area here. And you can lift it by clicking these clamps here on the sides, and then you can lift and drop very easily. And you want to pull them this evenly so that they stay roughly at the same level. I can find that they get a little stuck if one gets significantly higher than the other. So I just lift that up a little bit, and that just makes it a lot easier to slot that rail through. If it's resting too low, then it will run across the machine bed, and it might not even work to latch it on both sides to screw these pieces in because the rail is resting too low for the bed of the machine. So just keep that in mind. That can be a little confusing. Now, if you click on these, and you can't move it up and down at all, what that means is that you need to loosen the screw. There's a screw right here, and there's a screw on the back side, And these are just like little screws that embed into the metal here, and that locks it in place to limit how much that can move up and down. From the factory, these are screwed in pretty tight, so that might be why you can't adjust this. But as you can see, that is meant to be adjusted. You have all these little slots here that help you know what level they are on. So you want to be able to adjust this not only high to get it through and just initially set up, but now you want to adjust it lower so it's at the right height for quilting. So right now I'm going to take this to a fairly low level on both sides, and then we'll go from there. I'm going to aim to have it so that I can just barely squeeze my fingers between that rail and the surface of my machine bed. So here you can see that space again between the machine and that back rail. It's about 1/4 inch of space or so. And as I bring the machine forward, let's talk about this front rail and where that should go. I usually have this set to the same level as my back rail. So 4 clicks from the bottom seems to be pretty good for this machine. And again, you're going to adjust it by clicking on this clamp and shifting up, shifting down. If you run into issues such as skip stitches or broken threads, it is something that you could play with to troubleshoot to see if it might be the height of your rail. I'd say the only time that you're going to really have struggles though is if the rail is set up way too high. Because if you set this rail up way too high, you're going to put a lot of distance between the quilt and the bed of the machine, and that's going to create bounce, it's going to create too much movement around the needle, and that's what usually results in skip stitches or broken threads. So I think just on general principle, setting this up a little lower is not a bad thing. And it might create a little bit of drag if the quilt is set up really low, but that might actually give you a little bit more control over the movement of the machine. So a lot of things to think about there. This is definitely something that you just have to kind of play with, see what works best for you. Now that the machine is all set up, the rails are in the right position, it's time to start quilting. I have pinned a little practice sandwich to my leader cloth, and I think this is a really good idea just to use plain fabric for your first, 2 or 3 projects initially. This is going to help you understand how to move the machine, how to operate the speed, and troubleshoot. I don't think it's a good idea to jump right into a super special quilt especially. That's just a general bad idea with any new machine, any new system. You want to get some practice in first. So this is just 100% woven cotton fabric on the back. I've got a thin batting and then regular 100% woven cotton on top. And I've already done some quilting here, just some playing around. And I have pinned this to my leader cloth. This is special leader cloth for the Q-Zone hoop frame. It has a rope in the top that just helps you start that curling, rolling process, because this is how this frame is going to work. As you advance the quilt and quilt more on it, you're going to roll the quilt up on that leader cloth and roll your way steadily downward. You can also see how you can have a bigger quilt on this frame. Obviously, I've got all this long leader cloth here. So you can definitely pin a much bigger quilt to this leader cloth. I just have both of those just draping down the side, so that works. And this is another reason why I think it's a good idea just to get started with something small. You can master this, something small first, and then work your way up to a bigger quilt. Okay, so this looks good. I've roughly centered this up, and I want to make sure to clamp so that way I have a nice new space to work in. I'm going to place the clamp like this, and I always work from the middle. And let's say I'm trying to nest this design, so I have something quilted up here and I want to kind of nest the 2 rows together. Well, then I'd want to bring the machine back and make sure that I could quilt far enough back to nest those designs together. And if I haven't left enough space, I can always unclamp and unroll a little bit of quilt, or I could roll up a little bit more, just depending on what I'm needing. So that looks good. I'm going ahead and put all 3 clamps back here along the back rail, just like so. And then now I'm going to bring around, these are these little clamps, these little clips. They clip on the front, just like that. You tug on that black cord and then just tuck it into the little plastic piece to keep it out of your way. You don't want to stitch that to the back of your quilt. I'm going to do that here and here. And one thing, if your quilt is starting to roll up and get a little bit bulky, go ahead and shift that roll so it's on the top of those clamps. And the reason being, you'll have a little bit more room to work in. If your tube and roll of quilt is back here, well, obviously that's going to be hitting the back of your machine and limiting your quilting space. If you pop it up here on the surface of those clamps, then you have a little bit more room to quilt in. And yeah, quilting space is the thing that you want to maximize as much as possible with every single row. There we go. Okay, so now that the back is clamped in place, I always like to just kind of spread and smooth. You do need to layer the layers of the quilt together, meaning just generally get the backing spread out, the batting, and the quilt top. You need to go on ahead and have everything layered. It does not actually need to be pen basted, but it does need to be layered in a way where it's not going to get wrinkly, it's not going to come apart. And I always like to do that little bit of smoothing to make sure that it doesn't have any puddly fabric on the back or anything like that. Okay, now I'm going to clamp the front clamps and just give that a little rotate. And this is what you're going for. You want it to be kind of springy. You don't want it to be too tight. If you get this too tight, an example of too tight would be just rotating these this way. You can see how much tighter that can become. You don't want it too tight because the tighter pull can pull against your needle and thread in a weird way, and that can create thread breaks. So watch out for that. Don't try and get this just super, super, super tight. This is the same for any frame in general. I think the number one problem that most beginner quilters have when quilting on a frame for the first time is we want to crank it down, and that's not the way you do it. You really want a little bit more looseness there. So now with the front clamped, I'm going to work on the sides. And for that, we have this little side piece to the leader cloth. And what I do is I just place this right on the side and some pens. Now, if the quilt is big enough, you just simply drape that over the side and place your clamp on top. If your quilt is not big enough, like this one is significantly smaller, then I'm going to pen this. And then I could clamp if it was enough, if it was wide enough, but it's actually not. It's running just a little bit short. If I try and clamp, I might be able to get, see, it's just falling right out. So instead, here's what I do. When it's really short, let's say a really narrow quilt is in the frame, then I take the clamp and put it upside down and click it in place like that. And then I'm going to take my bungee cords. Now these come with the frame as well. All of the clamps, by the way, come with the frame. That's just a standard thing because that's how the frame works. And I have slotted in this little bracket, and then I have that little guide there. And I'm going to take that white bracket, and that is going to slot onto this side clamp, just like so. Just slot that in place, and that holds that on that side. And I'm going to do 2 on both sides, and then I can just fold that leader cloth over and clamp to it. So that's going to, again, also hold it nice and taut, kind of pulling it gently this way, putting that little bit of pressure, and so that way it keeps the quilt nice and straight. Okay, so I have just penned with 3 pens across the side. I'm going to do the exact same thing on the opposite side. We're ready to go. So one other thing that you can adjust on this frame is your handlebars. You can just unscrew this little bracket here, and you can place these wherever you want. And I kind of like mine at this outward angle. That works great for me. And I just spin that back and clamp it in place. It's kind of like a little adjusty clamp thingy. There we go. That looks good. And now it's time to start quilting. I've got my quilt clamped in place. It's ready to go. Now this entire thing is a practice sandwich. If it was a real quilt, I might want to try and have a little space over on one side just so I could do a little bit of practice, just to make sure, check in, make sure that my tension look good, my stitches look good. As it is, this entire quilt is practice. So first thing I'm going to do is needle down and needle back up, and I'm going to tug on that top thread. That's going to bring up a loop. That loop is my bobbin thread, and I always do this. Every time I start quilting, I always pull up my thread to the surface, and then I drop my needle back in the down position. And what this does, on the Janome 1600 is it ensures that the needle is always going to drop into the down position every time I stop quilting. And it's also going to ensure that, let's say I walk away from the frame and my cat comes in and hits it. It's not going to go anywhere because that needle is locked down in that spot. It's not going to go anywhere. Okay, so this looks good. We're operating with the foot pedal, and this is something you need to think about. It is very easy to grab a hold of these handlebars and want to pull on this machine, but the machine cannot move with the needle in the down position. It cannot move until you put your foot down and give it some speed. So the first thing to do is to put your foot down and start powering the machine. In fact, actually, I would say the first thing that you need to do is actually just sit there and put your foot on that foot pedal and press, and don't move the machine. Yeah, you'll get a hesitation knot, but you need to remind yourself always the needle must move before the machine moves, before you grab a hold of those handlebars. And the reason is, if you are moving the machine and not pressing on the foot pedal, you're going to get broken needles, because basically that means that you're going to be having the needle in the down position and trying to move the machine like that, and it's going to cause the needle to bend and then break. Okay, so let's check out and see how much space we have to quilt in. Looks like that's my limit of my frame. I'm going to run just a nice big line of stitches here. You can see I am just running the machine at a steady, constant rate. You can fluctuate. I can speed up, and this is, I gotta say, where the Janome 1600 really shines, because it can go so fast. I'm not even running it at full speed yet. That is getting closer to full speed. You can see just how fast I can move because this machine can handle it, because this machine has such a high speed. It doesn't have a very big heart space, so this is as much space from here to here is as much space as I can quilt in, but I can do quite a lot. Let's try that nice high speed, and let's do some stippling here. And so you might be wondering, just about designs and stuff. Well, basically any design that you've learned to quilt on your home machine, that same design is going to work just fine whenever you put that machine on a frame. The same basic rules, whatever you've memorized, however that design works, you're going to apply those basic rules and steps to quilting on a frame, and you're going to work in rows like this. And look how pretty those stitches are. They're nice and small stitches because I'm balancing that high speed of that needle bouncing up and down with my movement. I'm keeping my movement very smooth and steady. Now, if I was to slow down even more, my stitches would get, fairly microscopic. So I'd want to go on ahead and slow down the machine a little bit. I'd want to just loosen up on how hard I'm pressing it with my presser foot, with my foot on the foot pedal, I mean. So there we go. That is looking beautiful, and I'm just amazed by how fast this can go. I mean, I'm rocking this and moving this just as fast as I would move one of my long arms, because the machine can keep up with me. And all I'm doing here, guys, is I'm just pressing my foot on the foot pedal, and I'm just trying to keep my foot pressing at a nice steady rate, and then I'm just making sure that my hands are moving the machine at a nice steady rate too. So this is a balancing ratio, but it's so much easier feeling because the machine can go so fast. Now you might be wondering how I break thread. Let's say I'm at the end of my design, I'm ready to move forward, or I just simply need to break my thread. First thing I'm going to do is lift my needle into the up position, then lift the foot so that takes the tension off of it. I can tug on that top thread, move the machine away a distance. That's going to spool out my bobbin thread, so I'm sure that I have a nice long thread tail in my bobbin. Then I'm going to reach forward and hit my thread cutter. You want to make sure your foot is in the down position for that. That breaks both my top and bobbin thread. So now I can take that thread tail, I can give it a tug. That's going to pull up a loop. I pick at that loop. That loop is my bobbin thread. And then now I can just tie off and bury these two thread tails. I just tie an overhand knot, and then I grab a cheater needle. I keep those on this little handy pen place, a single needle pen cushion. I keep two of them right here on the top of my machine, always handy, and then I can run these thread tails into the middle layer of the quilt. So just push the machine away a little bit, grab that cheater needle. Cheater needle is my slang for a self-threading needle. It has a groove in the eye, so I can quickly pop those thread tails in place. And I'm just running that needle through the middle, through the batting layer of the quilt. And then give it a tug. That knot pops right inside, and then I just clip off these thread tails. So that is how I tie off and bury my thread tails. That's how I cut my thread using the automatic thread cutter. Makes it very quick and easy. Now you might be wondering about the foot that I am using and how I'm getting it to have this open toe facing the direction that I'm quilting on a frame. Well, this is a combination of 2 foot kits. This is the Convertible foot kit, and this is one of the most awesome darning feet ever. It looks really complicated, I know it does, but it is so amazing. I've shared some other videos on quilting on a home machine with the machine down in a table, so you can see those videos. But basically you have the spring here on the side that allows you to adjust the foot so it has the right height. And this is something that I forgot to mention at the beginning. You really want to make sure that your foot is skimming the quilt surface. You can see how low that is. You can hear it. I hope you can hear that the foot is scraping the surface of the fabric. It's not squishing it, but it's also not hovering so high to allow the quilt too much bounce. And you can adjust that just so easily by rotating that spring here on the back, lifting the foot or lowering it down. Now it's convertible because you can change out the bases. There's a screw back here that you can change out this bottom part. And the convertible foot sets, depending on the machine, some have more options for the base. For the Janome 1600, you get an open toe and a closed toe. And then you can also add this extra frame quilting foot set. And the frame quilting foot set comes with 2 bases, an open toe base, a second open toe, and a ruler base. So this is the set you need if you want to do ruler quilting or you want to do frame quilting. Now you might be wondering, okay, well, what's the difference between the open toe? This is the original open toe, and here's the reason. It would face this way. So if I put this one on, and this is the original open toe that comes with the convertible foot kit, it faces the front of the machine if you're setting in a table. You know, if you were facing the machine in a traditional way. The frame quilting open toe faces you when the machine is on a frame. So that is super useful. As you can see, it gives you just perfect visibility of the needle. You can clearly see where you're going, where that needle is going to hit, and that's going to give you a lot more control and precision over your quilting. So yeah, that is the foot that I'm using. I highly recommend it. It just, you know, that ability to adjust, the ability to change out the bases, it really is amazing. So now let's work in more detail about checking your tension. This is something I was really focusing on speed before, not so much on tension. And this is something that can be very tricky. So I think the very first step is to just pull up your bobbin thread and stitch a straight line from top to bottom. And you want to have a nice even line of stitching. You know, try and keep your speed nice and well, just steady. I think that's really the best bet. So once I stitch straight down, now I'm going to stitch straight over because I need to have a little bit of distance between that line of stitching and where I can actually see it. So I'm going to unpin this side and then take a look at my stitches. And this is one of the downsides of this frame is that, you know, when you get into the middle of a quilt, it's going to be really hard to check your tension without basically taking the whole quilt off the frame and testing it on another practice sandwich with the same materials just to see what things are doing. So, you know, you're going to have to just think about that. I think once you set it and get it solid, it's probably going to be good throughout that process, you know, through that entire bobbin. It's only when you go to change your bobbin, when you go to change a different type of thread, that you might need to adjust your tension. So here I'm pulling back on this a little bit and taking a look at those stitches. A nice delineation. You can see kind of that little space between each stitch. That looks great. I can also look at the surface and that looks really nice as well. So I don't need a tension adjustment, but let's talk about if I did. If I saw dots or loops on the surface of the quilt, that would tell me that the top tension is too tight and pulling too hard on the bobbin case. In that case, I would loosen the top tension. If I flipped over the quilt and I saw loops on the bottom of the quilt, on the back, and they were being pulled, like the thread was being pulled to the back, then that would tell me that the top tension was too loose and needed to be tightened up. Now that basically calls in the question, do I ever adjust my bobbin case? And the answer is typically no. I don't usually adjust my bobbin case once I've set it. And I have another video on how I've set the tension on my bobbin case when I was unboxing and setting up my machine. Once I set that bobbin tension, do that yo-yo test, I don't typically have to adjust that again, even when I move the machine to the frame. I don't have to adjust that again because basically it sets it up to be perfect for any style of stitching. So the only tension dial that I typically adjust is my top tension. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot about using a Janome 1600 on a little Q-zone hoop frame. Now, I personally feel like the Janome 1600 is a great choice to get started with frame quilting. It goes really fast and it has a perfect single straight stitch. That means that the needle's not wobbling all over the place. It's only going up and down. It also has a front-loading bobbin, which is a lot more convenient to change out while you're quilting versus a top-loading bobbin where you're going to have to actually unclamp your quilt in order to get to your bobbin case and change your bobbins. Another great advantage of the Janome 1600 is it's compatible with both Grace speed controller and our Sure Stitch regulator. So if you don't want to have to use your foot pedal with this machine, you have other options. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the Janome 1600 or the Grace Q-zone hoop frame, you can find both on my website at leahday.com. Until next time, let's go quilt.